In today's video, we're going to be doing a big hurricane season update, taking a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies across the board, looking at this map here and also some charts later on just to talk about this potentially historic hurricane season. Now, it's going to be tough for this to be the most active season of all time, but I do think that it will be one of the most active of all time, and there's a lot of contributing factors there. One of which is going to be the extremely warm sea surface temperatures across the board for all of your relevant areas. And what I mean by that is, we're not talking about the Arctic up here. We're not talking about areas south of what we call our MDR. These are going to be your two most irrelevant areas for tropical activity. Areas down here are not going to see tropical development. And then areas in the Arctic, although storms may move into here, they are going to break up whether it's above or below normal sea surface temperatures 9 times out of 10. So these two areas are going to be relatively pointless to this video. But for the areas inside of here, like this is going to be your main area of relevance, I guess is what we'll call it. I feel like it's been, that's pretty cutthroat. But for the hurricane season, this is what really matters. And particularly the areas in here are going to be the primary focus. This is going to be your MDR, more specifically the areas in this little bubble here, because again, a majority of our storms are going to be moving from Africa. We see these tropical waves move off of Africa over the open water here into our MDR, again is what we call it, that stands for main development area, and we either see them dissipate over this area depending on things like sea surface temperatures, dust, wind shear. Those are a lot of your determining factors. Or we see them flourish in these areas, and oftentimes they don't develop too much over this area. It's mostly once they get close to the Caribbean over here is when you would like to see them start to develop oftentimes, or I guess you would not like to see them develop, better yet. But this is going to be the area where you would see them develop if they're going to, is better words. And typically, a big thing happens here. We're getting pretty educational here, but when they move south of areas like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, especially when they're significantly far south, like let's say pretty close here to South America, we call this kind of a hurricane graveyard because there's oftentimes a lot more dry conditions down here. It's quite desertous, actually, for a lot of these coastal regions of northern South America. So it's dry. Oftentimes there's a lot more shear in this area, and we see storms break up. We have seen some pretty bad storms, though. A lot of times move through this area, but kind of curve northward through here. And this track tends to do pretty well if they avoid this southern Caribbean area for the most part. Your main areas where really we would see a lot of bad development is going to be the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, because these areas are typically extremely warm as far as the waters are concerned. A lot of times, especially in La Niñas, like the one that we're heading into, you see a lot less wind shear in here, and it's far enough west of Africa to where dust, a lot of the time, is not going to be as big of a factor. So this is the main area where you will see the significant development of hurricane activity, and that's why a lot of times the Gulf Coast suffers, Florida suffers, the Caribbean suffers. These are your main areas where we see some of the worst impacts of hurricanes a lot of times. Sometimes the East Coast, especially the southern East Coast, will get hit by some really big ones as well. And I want you to take note of something. So again, most of our storms originate from Africa and move through these areas. Look at how warm those waters are. This is going to aid in the development as they're basically halfway to this kind of finishing area that they will typically move towards. And this is going to aid in development, especially if there's not as much wind shear present, which again, La Nina, we're expecting less of it. That doesn't mean that all the time there will be less of it, but a majority of the time there will be. And dust, which is really, really hard to forecast in the long range, so we will call that our wild card factor, I think would be a great way to put it. But as far as sea surface temperatures stand, which is the main one that we can predict in the long range, it is looking extremely ripe for development already across the Caribbean and areas just to the east of it. Even the Gulf of Mexico, although it's not quite as warm as the Caribbean, is pretty significantly above average. I would say most areas are about a half a degree to a degree above average Celsius, which is pretty significant here across a lot of your Gulf of Mexico. even the southeast coast, offshore of Florida and offshore of Georgia and South Carolina, a majority of these areas are above average as well. It's not until you get pretty close to the mid-Atlantic where you see these below normal sea surface temperature anomalies. But these areas stay cooler, and typically we're seeing storms already dissipating by the time they get here. So this will be a lot less of a factor than it seems like. It's mostly the areas where the storm would still be strengthening a lot of the time, where the sea surface temperatures are really going to come into play. And this is overall almost worst case scenario. I guess it could be warmer. It always could be, right? But as far as just the sheer amount of coverage of above average sea surface temperatures, this is nearly worst case scenario. I will say things have improved slightly over the last month or so, and we have seen some cooling, and it's a little less significant at this point, so there has been some improvement. But still, we are on pace for some really, really ripe conditions still. Now, your Niño 3.4 index, which is your main index that they're going to use to determine if we're in a La Niña or an El Niño, has stayed pretty stagnant over the winter and even into the early spring. But we've seen these little dips with a little bit of a recovery, dip, even further recovery, and then we saw an even bigger dip, which took us to the lowest point we've been in months here at just about a half a degree above average. We have seen a little recovery, but as you've seen, these are pretty normal, even as we're slowly descending, and we can expect more dips in the future that'll bring us even lower until we eventually break below this neutral line, and then eventually as well the La Nina line, which will be the negative 0.5 degree line there. So we will likely eventually see that break below it. The earlier that happens, the more impactful it's going to be. Something that a lot of people don't know is that there's usually a lag in the effects of these things. So once we cross into La Nina territory, it's common to not really see the La Nina effects as far as the effects on the other areas of the world, not directly where that La Nina is taking place, but the worldwide impacts will take about a month to set in, even longer in some cases. So if this were to occur as late as, let's say, September, you wouldn't see the impacts start until about October, and then probably the majority of your hurricane season is done. But let's say we see this crossover into La Nina territory in June, July timeframe. Well, likely we're going to see those La Nina impacts start for August and probably the entirety of the hurricane season. So the timeline plays a massive, massive role there. And with these drops and recoveries, it's pretty hard to predict the exact timing there. And that is something that I am watching that will play a pretty big role here as far as the outlook for the hurricane season, the final outlook that is, in what we end up seeing. Now, here's the overall North Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies. And like I said, we have seen some pretty drastic cooling. We started out here in January about 0.6 degrees Celsius above average. And we've seen this kind of descent with some recoveries like I talked about. It looks like a stock chart. That's always what I've kind of said. But we're seeing this consistent drop off, and we've really recovered now pretty consistently over the past 2 or 3 weeks here since about the beginning of April, to where we're already in about the positive 0.2, maybe positive 0.3-ish area there. So it is recovering, but we have seen some drop-offs. But that's the entire North Atlantic, so let's break it down in some subcategories here. Here's the Atlantic MDR, which I'm going to go back real quick. Again, to clarify, that is this area right here is going to be your Atlantic MDR. That's a little tilted there. Something like this. Tilted again. Come on, man. Right here is going to be your Atlantic MDR. And again, that stands for Main Development Region here. So that is your main development region because most of your waves start out here and they develop mainly in this area and then they move elsewhere, whether that's out to sea, East Coast, kind of a Florida hit, Gulf of Mexico hit, or even kind of a Southern Caribbean track, which again, they usually break up when that happens. But oftentimes they start off offshore of Africa and move through this area before really branching out. So that is your MDR right there. And here is the chart for that. Like I said, this has been pretty consistently about 1 degree above normal Celsius, but we have seen a recent drop off, as we have seen with much of the Atlantic here over the past 2 or so weeks, which is extremely good news because we're about half as warm as we were just a couple of weeks ago. It's hard to tell where it's going to go from here, whether we're going to see a further recovery or a further drop. And I think that the next few weeks are going to be really big as far as determining what the upcoming hurricane season is going to be like. Now, as we take a look at the Caribbean overall, this is one of the areas that has been consistently warming and that hasn't really stopped. Again, you get these kind of big time inclines and then little tiny drops, but the overall trend is incline. And we've stayed pretty stable right around this 1 degree above average mark, although we were mostly below it for the wintertime, and we've moved towards mostly on it or above it here for a majority of your spring so far. So there has been a slight incline in those temperatures in the Caribbean, which again is another big time area for the hurricane season. One final graph here, and this is the Gulf of Mexico, which I don't exactly know why this is, but the Gulf of Mexico fluctuates a lot more. It might be because it's a smaller region, so those temperatures changes are having larger impacts on this chart here. But we did see maybe around neutral temperatures for the beginning of winter. We increased to about a half a degree above normal. That kind of trended back down for February. And then we saw these big time spikes in the beginning of March where we went from about average around that kind of 0 degree line there all the way up to about a degree above average within about a week. We saw a small decline there with another large climb to above a degree above average, and now we've seen this kind of consistent decline, pretty slow but steady, back towards the 0.25 degrees above normal to about 0.5 degrees above normal. But it has started to recover here. We'll see if that is one of those small recoveries followed by more dropping, or if this is a turnaround event here. Only time will tell. I thought this was a good time to make this video because I think that we're right on the fringe of seeing some either make or break factors here in the sea surface temperatures that are either going to take us into the category of maybe a pretty active hurricane season but nothing special, or if we see a lot of these start to incline and recover, we're going to be back in the territory of mostly siding with a top 5 potential hurricane season for the upcoming hurricane season of 2024. So some big time things to track here coming forward. And now that we're moving closer and closer to the hurricane season, you know, sometimes we see tropical events in May or June. That's very early, but it does happen every so often. And oftentimes in active years, we tend to see those earlier systems too. We're getting close. And I want to start tracking this every other week, maybe every week, depending on the changes that I see. And really updating you guys on these things intermittently in between these kind of continental United States storms that we have ongoing. I felt like today was a good day to do it, and I'm glad that I did. It's fun to talk about, and I love tracking these things. And some of my very first weather videos were about the hurricane season, and it always reminds me of those days so many years ago. Anyway, guys, I hope you guys are having a great night. I hope that you guys decide to subscribe. We do upload every single day. And again, we are going to be updating you guys on the hurricane season here pretty frequently. You can even hit the bell icon for daily notifications when we upload so you never miss one. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy it. Leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.